The sensor log entry was only 11 words long. It read, "Unknown phenomenon detected at Sol blockade perimeter. Origin internal." That was all Commander Verath 7 of the Dominion Armada saw before every ship in the outer ring stopped receiving transmissions from the inner picket line. Not jamming, not static. The signals simply ceased, cleanly, precisely, the way a candle flame ceases when someone cups it between their palms. One moment there, the next not. And in the silence that followed, Verath 7 did something she had not done in 32 years of command. She stood very still and waited for someone else to speak first. Nobody did. That was the first sign that something had already happened, something none of them had been warned about. It had started the way most catastrophic miscalculations begin, with complete certainty on the part of those making them. The Dominion Convergence, a coalition of 11 spacefaring civilizations spanning 4-star systems, had placed the Sol blockade 19 months ago. The operation had a name that translated roughly into standard as the compassionate containment, a phrase the Dominion used when they wished to describe an act of overwhelming military force as something done for the benefit of those being overwhelmed. They were good at that kind of language. They had been practicing it for centuries. The justification had seemed reasonable at the time, at least to the Dominion's strategic councils. Humanity had achieved faster than light travel 8 years earlier, emerging from their solar system with a combination of raw enthusiasm and spectacular ignorance about galactic civilization that had genuinely alarmed several member species. Not because humans were violent, though the Dominion had carefully studied humanity's historical relationship with violence, and that study had produced some uncomfortable late-night reading for certain admirals. Not because humans were expansionist, though they were. Not even because of the incident near the Kepler relay, where a human scout vessel had accidentally triggered a territorial alarm so ancient the species that originally placed it had been extinct for 400 years. No. The real reason was simpler, and it had come from a military analyst named Sav Dren Hall, who had spent 6 years studying human behavioral patterns and had submitted a report that was still, 19 months later, classified at the highest level of the Dominion's intelligence directorate. His report was titled, "On the Problem of Civilizations That Do Not Recognize Ceilings." Most species, Sav Dren Hall had written, understood natural limits. When a civilization reached the boundary of what its biology, technology, or psychology could sustain, it plateaued. It found equilibrium. It became, in the grand sense, manageable. This was the fundamental assumption underlying Dominion expansion policy, that every species eventually found its ceiling, and that the Dominion's job was simply to ensure it found that ceiling before causing too much disruption. Humans, the report concluded, appeared constitutionally incapable of recognizing ceilings as ceilings. They kept going. Through resource scarcity, they innovated. Through biological limitation, they modified themselves. Through political collapse, they rebuilt. Through grief that should have broken civilizations and had broken civilizations multiple times in their history, they persisted with a stubbornness that Sav Dren Hall found, in his own carefully bureaucratic way, deeply unsettling. He had written, "The concerning characteristic is not their aggression, it is their refusal to accept finality." Other species, when confronted with overwhelming force, recalibrate. Humans appear to recalibrate toward the overwhelming force. The report recommended containment, not war. War implied humans had done something wrong, and the Dominion preferred to avoid that kind of moral accounting. Containment, a blockade. Time to observe, to understand, to determine whether humanity could be integrated into galactic civilization in a manner that did not result in humanity eventually running galactic civilization. The blockade was placed. 47 warships. A sphere of interdiction around the Sol system, close enough to prevent human vessels from breaking the perimeter, but far enough to avoid being accused of occupation. The Dominion sent a diplomatic communication explaining that Earth was being quarantined for civilizational assessment purposes, which was the kind of phrase that sounds almost reasonable until you sit with it for a moment and realize it means we are locking you in a box until we decide what to do with you. Humanity's response had been, in Verath 7's professional assessment, concerning. Not because they were angry. She had expected anger. Anger was legible. Anger she had dealt with before. They had been quiet. Dr. Yale Navarro had not slept properly in 6 months. This was not unusual for her. She had a documented history of sleeping in 3-hour fragments during research phases, which her colleagues had long since stopped trying to correct, and had simply begun accommodating, leaving coffee in specific locations around her lab as a kind of navigational system for a woman who moved through exhaustion the way other people moved through air. But the last 6 months had been different. The last 6 months had been the kind of sleeplessness that doesn't come from excitement or obsession, but from something quieter and heavier, something that sits behind the sternum and doesn't move. She called it the feeling of working on the last possible thing. Her lab was on lunar station Kerensky, which had been established during humanity's first serious push into space, and had since grown into something resembling a small city arranged in tiers underground, lit by panels that mimicked natural daylight cycles with the desperate sincerity of something that knows it's performing. The blockade was visible from the observation deck. Not literally, the Dominion ships were too distant, but the effect of it was visible. The absence of departing vessels. The silence of docking schedules. The way people on the station had started walking slightly differently, with their shoulders in, the way people walk when they are in a space that has become smaller than it was. Yale barely noticed the walking. She was focused on the mathematics. The mathematics had been her obsession for 11 years, long before the blockade, long before humanity had even achieved its first FTL transit. She worked in a field so specialized that it had, until recently, no practical application whatsoever. A field studying the geometric properties of certain theoretical spacetime configurations that her dissertation advisor had called genuinely beautiful and almost certainly useless. She had thanked him for the compliment and ignored the second half of the assessment. She was studying what physicists called a null topology, a region of spacetime that existed in a state of such extreme geometric tension that it was, in a meaningful mathematical sense, outside conventional spacetime rather than within it. Not a wormhole, not a fold, something harder to describe, an absence so structured that it had properties, a hole with edges sharp enough to cut reality. She called it the void because she had never been particularly interested in naming conventions, and because that was what it felt like when she stared at the equations long enough. A void. Something that was not nothing. Something that was the shape of nothing made precise. When the blockade went up, her funding was redirected. All non-essential research was suspended. She received a very polite message from the Lunar Station Administrative Board explaining that resources were being reallocated to immediate strategic concerns, which she understood to mean the various military and diplomatic efforts that were, by all available evidence, accomplishing nothing. She kept working anyway, with her own equipment, in hours that didn't belong to anyone official. She had become very good at existing in hours that didn't belong to anyone official. Her assistant, a young man named Kato who had been assigned to her lab before the blockade, and had simply never left, because he had nowhere more important to be, watched her work with the specific expression of someone who understands approximately 60% of what they are seeing, and has made peace with that percentage. He brought her coffee. He maintained the equipment. He occasionally asked questions that she answered in a way that was technically complete and practically incomprehensible. One night, station night, which arrived on schedule regardless of what the universe outside was doing, he asked her what the void actually was. She was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that meant she was translating something from a language only she spoke. "It's the place," she said finally, "where the rules stop applying." He waited for her to elaborate. She didn't. 3 weeks later, she produced the first stable mathematical proof that a null topology could be deliberately induced rather than naturally occurring. It was 47 pages long and contained a section in the middle that her graduate advisor, had he still been alive to read it, would have recognized as the moment where the mathematics stopped being beautiful and started being something else entirely. She sent it to 12 people. All of them worked in fields adjacent to hers. All of them had the specific quality she required, which was not brilliance. She knew many brilliant people, and brilliance alone was not what she needed, but endurance. The capacity to sit with an idea long enough for it to change shape. She did not send it to the government. She did not send it to the military. She had a reason for this that she kept to herself, which was that she understood with the particular clarity that comes from having spent 11 years on a problem, that the moment this became a weapons program, it would stop being science and start being a different thing entirely. A thing she wasn't sure she could control. A thing she wasn't sure anyone could control. She wanted to understand it first. She had about 4 months before someone else figured out what she was doing. Verath 7 received the second anomalous report 42 hours after the first. This one was longer. It came from the senior communications officer of the Inner Picket, former Inner Picket. She corrected herself, since 3 of the 6 ships had repositioned themselves without explanation, which was technically a violation of blockade formation protocols. But trying to enforce formation protocols when you didn't know where the threat was coming from felt like correcting someone's grammar during an earthquake. The report described a sensor reading. A very specific kind of sensor reading that Verath 7 had only seen once before, in simulations, during her advanced command training 30 years ago. The simulation had been theoretical, a teaching exercise about edge case spacetime phenomena that instructors presented to young officers, not because they were likely to encounter them, but because the exercise usefully illustrated the boundaries of what sensor equipment was designed to detect, what it was not designed to handle. The sensor reading described a region of space, approximately 40 kilometers in diameter, located at a point between the inner picket line and Earth's moon that was returning no data, not interference, not a scanning error, no data, as if the region had simply opted out of being measurable. She cross-referenced it with the communication cessation timestamp from the first report. The dates aligned almost perfectly. She was still looking at that alignment when her tactical officer said, very quietly, "Commander, I think it's moving." Verath 7 looked up. The region was moving, slowly, barely perceptibly, but with the specific quality of movement that distinguishes something drifting from something going somewhere. She gave the order to increase the distance between the blockade and the anomaly. Not retreat. She was careful about the language she used in official logs. Strategic repositioning. Then she composed a message to Dominion High Command. She sent it. Then she sat down, which was something she rarely did during active operations, and she thought about the 11-word sensor entry that had started all of this. Unknown phenomenon detected at Sol blockade perimeter. Origin, internal, not approaching from outside the system, not launched from Earth's surface in any conventional sense. Originating, as near as the sensors could determine, from the region between Earth and its moon, which meant it had been constructed, or opened, or induced from within the blockade, from inside the containment. She had assumed the blockade was containing humanity. She was now sitting with the very uncomfortable possibility that the blockade had simply given humanity a reason to stop looking outward and start looking somewhere else entirely. Yale was in the middle of her 4th consecutive hour of calibration work when Kato told her the Dominion had moved the inner picket. She didn't respond immediately. She was holding a very delicate measurement instrument, and the reading she was taking was sensitive enough that breathing incorrectly would compromise it. After about 30 seconds, she carefully completed the measurement. She set the instrument down. She looked at Kato. "How far?" "About 12,000 kilometers." "They repositioned the whole ring." She nodded slowly. "Good, good." Kato had the expression of someone who had signed up for a research assistant position and was finding the experience to be considerably more existentially expansive than the job description implied. "They saw it," she said. "That means it's working." "What's working?" She pulled up the diagnostic screen and turned it so he could see. He looked at it for a long moment. He was reasonably good with physics. She had made sure of that when she selected him, and she watched him work through what he was seeing with the careful patience of someone who understood that some ideas required a moment. She watched his face change. It happened in stages. First, the recognition. He understood the mathematics, knew what a null topology was theoretically. Then the application, understanding that the diagram she was showing him was not theoretical. Then something harder to name, not quite fear. Something more like the feeling of standing at the edge of something you cannot see the bottom of. "This is real," he said. It was not quite a question. "It's real," she said, "and you opened it." "We opened it," she said, with the specific emphasis of someone who had spent 11 years on a problem and understood that language like I was insufficient for what had actually happened. "It took all 12 of us. The computations required more processing power than any single lab has. We had to distribute the load across 6 stations." He was quiet for a moment. "What is it? Actually, not mathematically." She considered this. She looked at the diagnostic screen at the representation of the region they had induced, a sphere of spacetime that was, in the most precise technical sense, not part of this universe, not part of any universe, the gap between states, the space that exists at the precise geometric point where physical law hits its own boundary and folds. It's a place where the universe's rules don't reach, she said finally. Nothing inside it obeys conventional physics, not light, not mass, not causality. He was very still. Can things go inside it? Yes. Can they come back out? She didn't answer immediately. This was a question she had spent considerable time with, in the particular way she spent time with questions that had mathematically clear answers she found emotionally difficult. The mathematics says yes, she said. Probably. Kato sat down. After a moment he said, does the government know? No. Does the military know? Not yet. Yale, he said her name the way people say names when they are trying to make a person hear themselves. You need to tell someone. She looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. I'm waiting. For what? For them to make the next move, she said. And she nodded toward the observation window, toward the invisible line of ships sitting in their perfect containment formation around humanity's home system. I need to know how they respond to this before I decide what to do with it. He stared at her. You opened a hole in the universe to test the Dominion's reaction. She picked up her coffee. I opened a hole in the universe because the mathematics was correct and the engineering was achievable, she said. The test is secondary. She paused. But it's not a test. Kato looked at the diagnostic screen for a long time. Then he said, what happens if something goes inside it? Something large? She was very precise in her answer. It ceases to be in this universe, she said. From the perspective of anyone observing, it simply stops existing. From the perspective of the thing that entered it, she paused. That's what I don't know yet. The silence that followed had a texture to it. She broke it herself. Get some sleep, she said, which was the kind of advice she consistently gave and consistently failed to take. Tomorrow we're going to need to start answering questions. She did not specify whose questions. She had a sense it was going to be several different categories of questions simultaneously, which was the kind of problem she found, in her particular way, genuinely interesting. High Admiral Sav Keth of the Dominion Convergence received Verath 7's report, read it 3 times, and then sat in his office for 11 minutes doing nothing except thinking. This was unusual. High Admiral Sav Keth was a being who moved through decisions quickly, who had built his career on the quality of rapid, correct assessment, who had never, in 40 years of service, needed 11 minutes to process a field report. At the 12-minute mark, he called in his science advisor. She was a Marin-born theorist named Dala, small and precise and possessed of the specific quality that Sav Keth valued above all others in his advisors, which was the willingness to say things he didn't want to hear. She read the report. She asked for the sensor data. She reviewed the data for approximately 20 minutes while Sav Keth waited with a patience that cost him something. Then she said, they opened a null topology. What does that mean? In practical terms, she set the data down. It means they found the gap between physical laws and then induced it deliberately. It means they created a region of spacetime that cannot be measured, cannot be interacted with using conventional physics, and cannot be navigated using any of our standard methods. She paused. It also means they have been working on this for some time. This is not a rapid response to the blockade. This research predates the blockade. Sav Keth was very still. How long? The mathematical framework for this kind of topology induction takes, by our models, between 8 and 15 years of specialized research to develop. Given that humanity achieved FTL 8 years ago, and this is by any measure more complex than FTL, she stopped. She looked at him. They started working on this before they could leave their own solar system. The room was quiet. Why? Sav Keth asked. Not tactically. It was a genuine question, a philosophical question. Why would a species that couldn't yet cross interstellar distances begin working on a problem this abstract, this removed from any practical application at the time? Dala appeared to understand that he was asking something deeper than strategy. Because they wanted to know, she said. That's the only answer I have. They wanted to know if it was possible. And now they know. Now they know. She picked up the sensor data again, not because she needed to review it, but with the specific quality of someone who needs something in their hands while they say the next thing. The concerning part, Admiral, is not the null topology itself. By itself, it's remarkable but not necessarily threatening. The concerning part is the location. Between the inner picket and the moon. Yes. Which means they opened it inside our containment zone. using resources that were presumably available within that zone, without our sensors detecting the research process, the energy signatures of the construction process, or any communication traffic that would have indicated coordination between multiple stations. Keth looked at her. They coordinated silently. They communicated in ways we weren't monitoring, she said. Which means they understood our monitoring capabilities and adjusted to them. We gave them 19 months. Yes, she set the data down again. We gave them 19 months to observe us, and apparently at some point during those 19 months, they determined exactly what we could and could not see, and then they arranged their communications accordingly. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a strategic framework collapses quietly, without drama, the way a wall sometimes falls, not catastrophically, but simply revealing that it was never as solid as it appeared. Keth said, "What can they do with this thing? The null topology, what is it capable of?" Dala took a breath. "Theoretically, anything that enters it ceases to interact with our universe at all. Ships, weapons, sensor arrays. Anything we deploy near it would simply," she paused, searching for the right word, "cease from our perspective. And from their perspective, unknown." She looked at him directly. "That's what makes this so difficult. We don't know if they know what's inside it. We don't know what it does to matter over time. We don't know if it's stable. We don't know if it can be closed." She paused. "And the humans who built it, we don't know if they know any of those things either." Keth sat back. "You're telling me they may have opened something they don't fully understand. I'm telling you that even if they don't fully understand it, they opened it anyway." She looked at him with an expression that contained something he could only describe as reluctant professional respect mixed with something older and less comfortable. "That's not recklessness, Admiral, or it's not only recklessness. It's a different kind of calculation. The calculation of a species that has decided that finding out what something does is worth the cost of not knowing beforehand." He stared at the sensor data for a long time. Then, "Get me a communication channel to Earth." "Official?" "Yes," he paused. "And get me Dren Hall's report, the original, the full version." She understood without being told which section he wanted to revisit, the section about civilizations that did not recognize ceilings. She left. He sat alone and thought about that phrase, "do not recognize ceilings." He had always interpreted it as recklessness, an inability to stop. He thought about it differently now. Perhaps it wasn't inability, perhaps it was refusal. Perhaps there was a species of mind that looked at a ceiling and saw it not as a boundary but as a question. Why is this here? What's on the other side? What happens if we keep going? And perhaps the terrifying thing was not that humans couldn't stop. Perhaps it was that at some level they couldn't imagine why they should. The official Dominion communication came through on a Tuesday, which was only notable because Yale had forgotten what day of the week it was and had to check. She was not the one who received it. That went to Earth's UN Emergency Coordinating Council, a body that had been formed specifically to handle communications with the Dominion, and that operated with the specific functional quality of a committee assembled from people who were each competent in their original fields and collectively uncertain about what they were doing. The council spent 6 hours discussing the communication before anyone thought to contact Yale, which gave her time to sleep for exactly 3.5 hours and wake up feeling not rested but slightly less dangerous. The communication, when she finally read it, was 15 paragraphs long. The first 12 paragraphs were diplomatic framing, carefully worded, polite in the specific way that things are polite when the person writing them is very aware they have made a mistake and is trying to reposition themselves without admitting it. The last 3 paragraphs were the message. They asked humanity to close the null topology. They offered, in exchange, substantive renegotiation of the containment parameters currently in place, which was the Dominion's language for "we will modify the blockade." Not end it, modify it. Yale read those 3 paragraphs several times. She showed them to Kato, who read them and said, "They're scared, but they're still in charge of this conversation." "They think they are," she said. "Are they not?" She set the communication down. She looked at the diagnostic screen at the stable, pulsing representation of the null topology they had created, 40 kilometers of spacetime that was, by any physical measure, somewhere else. Somewhere that didn't answer to the Dominion. Somewhere that didn't answer to anyone. "The problem," she said slowly, "is that they think this is a bargaining chip. They think we opened this to leverage the blockade negotiation." "Isn't that what it is?" She was quiet for a moment. "I opened it because the mathematics was correct," she said again. I opened it because 11 years of work produced a proof and then the engineering to test the proof, and the only way to know if the proof was right was to do it. The blockade made it urgent, yes. But the work, she stopped. The work was always going to happen, the blockade just determined when. He looked at her carefully. So it's not a weapon. No. Is it a door? She didn't answer immediately. That's what I don't know yet, she said. That's what I've been trying to find out. The question of whether the null topology was a door, whether something could pass through it and arrive somewhere, or whether it was simply an exit with no corresponding entrance, was the question she had been sitting with for 6 weeks. The mathematics was ambiguous in a way that she found both maddening and, secretly, thrilling. Because ambiguity in mathematics usually meant the phenomenon was more interesting than the equations could fully capture, which was her favorite kind of problem. She drafted a response to the Dominion communication herself. Not through the Council. She submitted it through the Council, but she drafted it, and the Council, which by this point understood roughly what she had done and was deeply unsure what to do with someone who had opened a hole in spacetime on her own initiative, let her draft it without much argument. The response was short. It said, "The null topology is a scientific phenomenon, not a tactical asset. It cannot be closed in the way you have requested. The mathematics that produced it does not contain a reversal function. We are still determining its properties." This was true. It was also, she knew, deeply alarming from the Dominion's perspective because it meant humanity had created something they didn't fully control, which was, depending on your perspective, either reckless beyond comprehension or honest beyond diplomacy. And she had decided that honesty was the correct posture here, partly because it was her default mode, and partly because she understood something important. The Dominion was afraid, and the specific thing they were afraid of was not the null topology itself. It was the implication of it. The implication that humanity, given 19 months of containment, had produced something that their most advanced science hadn't anticipated. Not as a military project, not with government direction, as a consequence of one person continuing to follow a question. She wanted them to sit with that implication. Not because she was cruel, but because she understood that the blockade's fundamental logic, contain them until we understand them, was based on a flawed assumption. The assumption that humanity, observed and limited, would become more legible. What they had actually become was focused. She sent the response. Then she went back to the null topology and started working on the problem she had actually been working on since the beginning. Not how to create it, not how to use it as leverage. The question she had written on a physical piece of paper and taped to the wall of her lab 11 years ago. The question that had outlasted 3 institutions, 2 funding crises, and 1 global civilization-level reorganization in response to alien contact. What is on the other side? The Dominion Council session that followed Yale's response lasted 9 hours and is not fully recorded in public archives, but Dalla was present, and what she told Sav Keth afterward was this. The Council had cycled through 4 distinct phases of response. The first phase was anger. How dare they respond this way? The tone was unacceptable. The implied threat was unacceptable. The second phase was strategic assessment. What were their options? Could they collapse the null topology externally? Their scientists said no, you couldn't interact with something that didn't interact with conventional physics. Could they tighten the blockade? Theoretically, yes, but the null topology was inside the containment zone, and tightening the containment zone around a region of spacetime that their weapons and sensors couldn't affect was not tightening. It was theater. The third phase was the most interesting, Dalla said, and the most troubling. The third phase was when someone in the Council asked, if we cannot contain something they made inside our containment zone, what does that mean for the theory of containment? Nobody had a good answer. The fourth phase was when the Council requested everything Dalla could find on null topology physics in Dominion scientific literature. She had reviewed this before the session. She gave them the number, 6 theoretical papers, all of them unpublished, all from within the last 30 years, all concluding that a stable induced null topology was theoretically possible in the far future under conditions of extreme computational and energetic advantage. Far future. Extreme advantage. One of the humanities' individual researchers had done it in 11 years with equipment available on a lunar research station. The room had been very quiet after that. Sav Keth asked Dalla later what she thought it meant. She said, It means we have spent 19 months assuming we were watching them. I think they were watching us. He said, and what did they see? She was quiet for a long time. A ceiling, she said finally. I think they saw what we considered a ceiling, and I think they noted it very carefully. She looked at him with the expression she wore when she had something to say that she had been turning over for some time. Admiral. I've been reviewing Dr. Navarro's published work, the work before the blockade. She has been researching null topology since before humanity had FTL, before they had any practical reason to research something so abstract. You told me that already? I know, but I want you to hear the rest of it. Dalla leaned forward slightly. She wasn't researching it as a weapon. She wasn't researching it as a propulsion system or a tactical advantage. Her early papers frame it as a pure mathematics problem, a question about the fundamental limits of physical law. She paused. She wanted to know where the universe's rules stopped applying, not to exploit it, not to escape anything, just to know. Savketh stared at her. That is the thing I cannot make fit any of our models, Dalla said. In our frameworks, in all 11-member civilizations' frameworks, research is directed. It has targets. It responds to need. You research what you need to survive, to expand, to compete. She paused. Humans have a separate category, research they pursue simply because the question exists, because not knowing is, to them, a kind of discomfort they cannot tolerate. She sat back. And the consequence of that, the completely unintentional, unpredictable consequence, is that they occasionally answer questions nobody else knew to ask, and the answers change what's possible. The silence that followed was the kind that comes after something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Savketh said, finally, send them a new communication, not modification of the blockade, full removal. He paused. And an invitation. Dalla blinked. To what? To whatever she finds on the other side. He looked at the sensor data one more time, the 40-kilometer sphere of not quite universe hanging in space between Earth's moon and his blockade line. Because the only alternative is to keep doing something that isn't working, and I have spent enough of my career doing that. Yale got the new communication on a Thursday. She had slept 4 hours the night before, which was good by her recent standards. Kato brought her coffee and stood next to her while she read it. She read it twice. Full removal, Kato said. That's their ending the blockade. Yes, because of the void. Because of what the void implied, she said. She set the communication down and looked at the diagnostic screen, at the stable, pulsing representation of the topology. It had been stable for 7 weeks now. Stable in a way that suggested it intended to remain stable, which was both deeply satisfying from an engineering perspective and slightly alarming from an existential one. Are you going to accept? He asked. Yes. And the invitation? She was quiet. The invitation was the stranger part. Unprecedented, really, a galactic civilization asking to observe a scientific experiment being conducted by a species they had just spent 19 months blockading. The specific quality of it was almost absurd. They had locked humanity in a room, and now they wanted to see what humanity had found in the room. Yes, she said, on one condition. What condition? She looked at the topology, at the space inside it that their sensors couldn't penetrate. At the question she had written on a piece of paper 11 years ago and still couldn't answer with certainty. They help us fund the second probe, she said. Kato stared at her. There's been a first probe. She nodded toward a small equipment bay at the back of the lab that had been sealed for 3 weeks. He turned and looked at it, then he looked at her. You sent something through already? Yes. When? 4 weeks ago. And you didn't tell anyone? She picked up her coffee. I didn't know what to tell anyone yet, she said. I still don't know, that's why I need the second probe. He was very still. What happened to the first one? That's what I need the second probe to find out, she said. From our perspective, it simply stopped existing, which is what the mathematics predicted. The question is whether that's the complete answer. He sat down. He had been doing that more often lately, sitting down when information arrived. She had noticed this and found it, in her way, endearing, the very human reflex of needing to be grounded when your understanding of the universe was actively shifting. What do you think is in there? He asked. She had been sitting with this question for 4 weeks. She had run every model she had. She had reviewed every piece of physics that was relevant and a substantial amount that was only tangentially relevant. She had lain awake in 3-hour fragments of non-sleep and thought about it until the thinking blurred into something that was more like intuition than analysis. I think, she said slowly, that the universe has edges, not the edges we thought, not the spatial boundary of the observable universe. That's not what I mean. I mean internal edges, places where one set of rules gives way to another. And I think what we built is a window to the place where that transition happens. She paused. And I think the reason no one else has built it is not that they couldn't, it's that they didn't keep asking the question long enough. Kato looked at the sealed equipment bay. If something is in there, alive, the probe. The probe was not designed for anything to survive, she said. It was an instrumentation package, a measurement device. What if something came back with it? She looked at him for a long moment. This was a question she had also been sitting with. She had performed 17 checks on the containment integrity of the topology's boundary. She had 17 sets of data suggesting the answer was no. She was working on the 18th check. Get some sleep, she said. He stood up, then stopped. Yale, the Dominion, they ended the blockade because they were afraid. Yes. Are they right to be? She thought about it. Not the tactical version of the question, not the strategic version, but the true version, the one underneath. Are humans, given enough time, something to be afraid of? I think, she said, they were right to pay attention. That's a different thing. She set down her coffee. Every civilization pays attention to what threatens it. The Dominion paid attention to whether we'd try to break the blockade, whether we'd build weapons, whether we'd resist. She looked at the topology. They didn't think to pay attention to whether we'd find something more interesting than the blockade to work on. Kato left. She turned back to the diagnostic screen. She pulled up the data from the first probe, the data they had collected before it entered the topology, the last 40 milliseconds of signal they had received. She had reviewed this data more than 300 times. She was going to review it again. She poured what remained of her coffee and sat down in the specific way she sat when she was going to be somewhere for a very long time. Outside, the Dominion ships were beginning their slow withdrawal, their formation geometry dissolving like a fist unclenching. The blockade was ending. 19 months of containment, concluded not because humanity had broken through it, not because humanity had overpowered it, but because humanity had turned around and found something more important to look at. She didn't watch them go. She had the data from the first probe. She had 18 checks to run. She had a question that was still unanswered. The universe, she had always believed, did not owe anyone clean answers. It offered data, and then it waited, patient and indifferent, for something stubborn enough to keep asking. For something that couldn't sit with the discomfort of not knowing. For something that found the edge of what was understood and felt not fear but the specific, exquisite pull of everything that was still unresolved. She started the 18th check. Outside, somewhere in the space between the Earth and the retreating Dominion fleet, the null topology pulsed quietly. 40 kilometers of somewhere else. A hole with edges sharp enough to cut the laws of physics. A question made into a structure. It had no idea what it was. It had no consciousness, no intention, no preference. But it waited the way all genuine discoveries wait, not for someone to approach it with plans and purposes, but for someone to approach it with nothing but the capacity to keep going. To send one more probe. To run one more check. To stay awake one more night inside the question. In the end, the Dominion had blockaded humanity because they were afraid of what humanity might do. They had never considered what humanity might find. And in that oversight, in that single miscalculation about the nature of a species that could not look at a locked door without eventually wondering what was on the other side, and then building a key, and then discovering that keys were a smaller idea than they had imagined, the entire geometry of the galaxy's understanding of itself quietly, irreversibly, began to change. The blockade had been meant to slow them down. Instead, it had given them somewhere quiet to think. And Yale Navarro, who had spent 11 years on a problem the galaxy considered impossible, began her 18th check with the same expression she had worn since the beginning. Not triumph, not relief, not the particular pride of someone who has been proven right. Just the patient, sleepless, inexhaustible focus of someone who knows the question is still open, and who cannot conceive of any good reason to stop.